So as World War II is ending, and it had quickly become apparent to all the generals in the United States that the alliance between the West and the USSR was disintegrating for a couple of reasons. First, the Soviet Union had wanted the U.S. and Great Britain and France to invade through kind of up through Italy, but then a little further east to help the Soviet Union kind of relieve pressure from the Germans. So the U.S. and when they decided to go D-Day instead, that doesn't really relieve the pressure off of the Russians. So that was one thing. Also, they never really trusted each other. Stalin and FDR, and then following up with Truman, they never trusted each other. And so it quickly disintegrated and became pretty apparent right away, even after the Yalta Conference, and then further after Potsdam, when Stalin says, no, I'm really not going to give self-determination to Eastern Europe. It quickly fades into what we now know as the Cold War. It's a Cold War because the U.S. and the Soviet Union never directly fought against each other. They're going to go back and forth, and they're going to fight proxy wars, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but they never actually fight each other. Now, there's a lot of different ways of what this was. It was the United States versus the Soviet Union. It was liberal democracy versus a dictatorship. It was capitalism versus communism. There was an arms race. There was a space race. There was NATO. There was the Warsaw Pact. There was Comecon. There was the Marshall Plan. I mean, all these are different things that go on. And we'll talk about them here a little bit more as we go through. The next slide is going to be a little bit of a timeline history for this. But realize this was a Cold War. It's like World War II was a hot war. Okay? That it was a hot war in the sense there was actual fighting between the two sides. And this is a Cold War because the US and the Soviet Union never actually fight each other. Yet this stare down, and I love this picture down here, the stare down that takes place is the paramount kind of world order for the rest of the 20th century, basically the rest of the 20th century. So right after the war, you have, first of all, the creation. Where am I going to put it? Let's put it over here. Now it's only covering the E in Europe. So right after the war, you have the creation of the United Nations. The Allies form a supranationalistic organization, basically made for keeping world peace. The League of Nations hadn't really worked. Hadn't worked keeping world peace, obviously. I mean, Japan and Germany just kind of leave. The biggest difference between the UN and the League of Nations is that Security Council. The Security Council's job is peace, and the decisions that the Security Council make are binding. The five powers, so that'd be U.S., Britain, France, China, and Russia, are always a part of the Security Council, and they also have a veto. So as the war goes on, the Yalta Conference, which we talked a little bit about, works to establish the early possible establishment for free elections as government responses to the will of the people. And Stalin wanted friendly governments to him in place to safeguard against Germany. There's actually pretty good evidence that he was even trying to take West Germany at the time just to create more of a buffer state. Communist governments are eventually going to take hold in Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Albania, and Yugoslavia. And basically, with the exception of Yugoslavia, those countries are pretty well under control of the Soviets. Yugoslavia is a different animal that we'll get to when we get post-Cold War. And so Truman sees this going on, and he sees we're going to come up with a doctrine. We're going to help with any country that wants to stand up to the Soviets. And he develops what's called the Truman Doctrine. Let's think about this is so much different of a foreign policy than what we had seen even before the First World War, when basically the Monroe Doctrine, or the Roosevelt-Carlery rule, that, hey, yeah, Western Hemisphere, we like you, but now we're getting involved in the Eastern Hemisphere. It was essentially the Truman Doctrine was a policy of known as containment, that we will help people. That the Soviets, you get what you have right now, but no more. And we're going to help anybody we can. You countries, you must choose democracy or communism. And so one of the ways we do that at first is something known as the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan comes out in 1948. It is a way that we're going to help rebuild Europe. And so we are giving out $12 billion to help spread capitalism. And basically, it's also to help build our economy, help rebuild Europe's economy, especially West Germany's economy. And also, we made it so that, like, France and Italy that had huge communist sides growing, it's not really going to work because we're going to we're going to rebuild the economy and we're going to try to keep them down. Also, it worked that the USSR was invited to participate, but we needed to win the political battle. So instead, the Soviet Union does not take the United States' money, and they formed the Council for Mutual and Economic Assistance in 1949, and this is to help trade with the USSR. Another thing that the Marshall Plan did is it basically made sure democracy would continue. There's a theory going on called the domino theory, that if one country becomes communist, the next country will become communist, and the next country will become communist, and the next country will become communist. This is not going to happen because the Marshall Plan is put in place, and it gives the U.S. a place to sell their goods. I mean, the U.S. accounted for about 50% of the world economy at the time, but they won't. So now, where are we going to sell their goods? We're going to help rebuild Europe. We're going to help rebuild Europe for that. It's called the Marshall Plan because the U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall was the person who did it, and Truman wasn't really well liked by Congress at the time. And so they decided to name it after Truman, or after Marshall, and not after Truman. So the other part of the Truman Doctrine that we're not going to allow communism to spread more is what's called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it's the U.S., Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Great Britain, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and West Germany are joined by 1955. It is a military alliance. We were providing for the safety and security of basically all of those countries, that we will not let the Soviet Union spread. Because one thing that had gone on here, and this relates back to the Marshall Plan as well, is that a bunch of countries were calling for Germany to pay reparations. And the U.S., basically political advisors had a long-term plan that, hey, that wasn't a good idea before. It didn't work. It basically kind of led to World War II. So they made a rule in place. Anybody takes money from the Marshall Plan, the U.S. would be first in line for any war reparations that would be paid by Germany. And since the U.S. wasn't collecting war reparations, nobody else could take them. So basically, in a way, the U.S. was saying, hey, take our money instead, and we're going to let Germany regrow. Now, the Warsaw Pact countries, those are countries that joined the Soviet Union. They are what is known as behind the Iron Curtain. It's the countries like Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, all of Eastern Europe that is underneath the Soviet control. Now, two of the spots of where this first is going to start is in Germany. Remember, Germany is divided into two, East and West. You have the East part that is purely Soviet, the West part that is democracy. And remember, Berlin itself was divided up. Now, Berlin is completely in the middle of East Germany. And so even West Berlin here, it's basically like an island. So the Soviet Union, when the West take their four parts of it and they'd make it into one, into West Berlin, the Soviets respond by blocking all the roads, all the rail, all the water. And so Berlin is really on its own. And so the U.S. has to figure out what to do. And when the U.S. figures out what to do, 1948, they said, okay, here's what we're going to try. Hey, Soviet Union, you're going to have to shoot us down. We already won a propaganda piece by the fact you turned down NATO money. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do an airlift. We are literally going to drop in all the supplies that West Germany is going to need. And so for the 11 months between 1948 and 1949, the Soviets don't shoot down any planes, and the U.S. literally drops everything in there. Everything. And remember, part of the Truman Doctrine is Soviet Union, keep what you have, but we're not going to let you expand anymore. And West Berlin stays a liberal democracy for the entire time. Now, from 1949 to 1961, the East Germans flee, and they go into West Berlin mainly to do that because West Berlin is a liberal democracy. And so, especially a lot of your more high-skilled people did. So in 1961, they are going to build a wall. The purpose of the wall? To keep people in. Now, think about that. Walls are usually meant to keep people out. This is a wall that keeps people in because people were trying to flee. And that wall will be there until the end and really becomes a symbol of the war itself. Now, two other pieces with the war is one is the arms race. There's a concept that is going to be absolutely paramount to this war, the Cold War, and that concept is mutually assured destruction. So think about it this way. You see the picture of a nuclear device here, and both sides continue to just work to build bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and more bombs. To the point they both had way more bombs you could ever need to destroy the world. But the theory was if they have more bombs, if we have more bombs, then then we will prove we're the better people. And a lot of them were propaganda plays. Well, the U.S. builds a first atomic bomb, Russia builds a second one, then hydrogen bombs are next, then nuclear-powered submarines, and then how about new intercontinental ballistic missiles? Alert, this leads to mutually assured destruction. That basically, if they launch their nukes, we're going to launch our nukes, and both sides are going to be destroyed. And so this is a huge part. Who can build bigger and better bombs? By the end of the Cold War, the U.S. basically the Soviet Union has more bombs, but the US's bombs are more accurate and we could hit something. And so that goes back and forth. The other part of this is the space race, which was also just a major propaganda play. And here's kind of a timeline. There we go. A timeline of it. And so it was again, it's kind of a sense of nationalism coming along with this here. The Soviets put Sputnik into space in 1957. It was kind of an eye-opening moment for the U.S. that the U.S. was beaten in something with technology for the first time. And really, what is that? It's a little ball. Literally, I mean, fit on your kitchen table. It's up in space, sending back these just beeps to Earth. The Soviets put the first man in space with Yuri Gagarin. And then when JFK comes into office in 1960, he makes a promise, hey, we are going to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And the U.S. does. And that was really the U.S. By that time, that was the U.S.'s win in the space race, is when the U.S. lands on the moon in 1969. This made sure that, hey, we won this propaganda play. So one thing that you should have noticed by now is a lot of this Cold War is propaganda, and it is propaganda and nationalism going on, and basically a battle for world power. That there's two schools of thought. Hey, join us, join the U.S., or join the communist side of things. Hey, we have better technology. This even shows up in the Olympics all over the place of who has better athletes. Things you got to know from this are definitely you got to know the Truman Doctrine. You should know how the Truman Doctrine played out. You should know basically what's against what during the Cold War, and there'll be more examples later. But hey, here you go. East Germany is the first one, and the Berlin Wall is the second example of how the Cold War is going to start to play out.